everyone, I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to Matan's One-on-One podcast, where we spend 30 minutes each week speaking about a seminal figure or idea on that week's Parsha. Today I have the pleasure of sitting down once again with Matan's Rosh Beit Midrash and academic director, Dr. Yael Ziegler, to speak about Parshat Beshalach.
It's great to be back.
Yael, who are we here to speak about today?
Well, I chose to speak today about someone who I think probably many of our listeners probably have not had a lot of exposure to, and that's one of the reasons I chose to speak about him. And that is Rabbi Moshe Shamah, who's he's the head of the Sephardic Institute in Brooklyn, and he wrote this wonderful book called Recalling the Covenant, which is a book on the Parshat HaShavua, which I came across at some point, and it moved me, and especially his pieces on Shirat Hayam, which is one of the reasons that I thought of him when you asked me to speak on Parshat Beshalach.
Yeah, I think that many shul rabbis or communal leaders sort of always dream of towards the end of their career, that they put out some sort of book on Parshat Shavua or their drashot. But there's something particularly erudite about this book, which I'm sure we'll get into together.
Yeah. It doesn't read like, sermons that are given from the pulpit. And it wasn't. I mean, it started out, I think, as part of, I think these seminars that he would give. I mean, there's pieces in the book where he's having a discussion with, some of his, I don't even know if they're students, some of his colleagues in the seminar. So it wasn't exactly clear to me because I'm not in the community. But there is a website called Judaic.org where all of these, pieces actually appear online.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. Good to know. We'll link it on the show notes.
Yeah.
Where did you first come across his writings?
So, I was trying to trace it back. I found him online. Nobody pointed me to him. I found one of these seminars that he gave, or one of these Parsha pieces that he wrote. And I was preparing a class at the time on Sefer Shemot, and I found some of his ideas really compelling. Actually, some of them, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later, were surprising to me that I found them compelling. So, I just kind of found him online, and then I started reading some of his ideas, and I was drawn to them. I felt that there were some very wise ideas, and he based his ideas in a lot of sources that
speak to you, that you would also confer.
Yeah, absolutely. And then some of his ideas that I would not have thought that I would have found compelling, like some of the number symbolism that he does, which I did find compelling. And what was interesting was that I would cite him sometimes in my classes. I went back over my notes to see which ideas I had found compelling, and some of them were really, as I said, on Parshat Beshalach. But later in, I don't know, maybe about 10 years later, I was speaking in the Syrian community in Brooklyn, and I don't even remember if I mentioned to somebody that I was an admirer of his work, or if somebody just came over and handed me his book. But this did in fact happen, that I was speaking at someone's house in Brooklyn, and they gave me his book. And it's a very heavy book. I think my first reaction was, oh no, how am I going to get that in my suitcase with the limited weight that I have going back to Israel? But it was well worth the whatever presents for my children I removed in order to bring this book back.
I would also say that it's, I don't know, I guess maybe it's not surprising. Maybe he's more well-known than we realize, but the book was in perfect form sitting in the Har Etzion library, which is where I took it out from there. So I guess more people know him than we realize. Yeah, no, I think in the Syrian community he's a seminal figure. That's my impression. Again, I don't really know personally, and I know that there is a strong kind of connection between the Syrian community and Herzog College. The main reason being that the Syrian community are very, very engrossed in the Tanakh. They're very knowledgeable in Tanakh, and especially in Pshat readings of the Tanakh, which is something that I think is, I would say, even, maybe almost a campaign of Rabbi Shamah in this book, this idea that he is a very careful reader of the
text itself. He pays careful attention to the nuances, the order, and the pshat, right? The simple meaning of the text, its internal logic, its nuances. So that's something that I think that the Syrian community in general has found in Herzog, and that's probably why his book is in the library. I have no idea why the book is there, but yeah.
I wonder where that tradition comes from, where they've brought it from their past, but I guess
just in general, I think the Tanakh is many of the people I know from the Syrian community can cite the Tanakh, really by heart in a way that certainly I didn't grow up with people in my community.
Maybe it was their love for the Aleppo Codex. Maybe
it could be connected to that. I don't know. I wonder if someone in the Syrian community could explain it, or if it's just something that they grew up with as well, which, the deep respect and love and commitment to Tanakh learning, which I've found in the Syrian community. I mean, whenever I go to America, I speak in Brooklyn, and I've met, I've encountered firsthand the enthusiasm and the excitement for Tanakh learning.
Great. Okay, so what does he have to offer us on this week's Parsha?
So, in general, maybe I'll just say something about his methodology, some of the things that I saw. So first of all, he uses a whole range of sources. He's not committed to using medieval Parshanut, shall we say, exclusively. He does use medieval Parshanut, but I don't know, let's say if I were talking about Nechama Leibowitz, I would probably focus on how deeply focused she is on medieval Parshanut, even though she uses modern scholars as well. But he's very sensitive to not just the literary, but also the background, because he's interested in pshat. He's interested in the geography. He's interested, we have it in this week's parsha where he talks about, he talks about where Chorev is, right? Given that God tells Moshe in Parshat Shemot that when he takes Am Yisrael out of Mitzrayim, you will worship God on this mountain. And given that at the beginning of this week's parsha, we're told that God is not going to take Am Yisrael on the shortest route to the land of Israel. So he engages the question, where is Chorev, right? So he's interested in geography. He's interested in ancient Near Eastern literature, very interested in that. He's at least attuned to it. It certainly is not the focus, but he is very much attuned to it. You're never going to find, I think, I can't say I've read the entire book, but I kind of flipped through to find the places where I would expect him to engage in a discussion about ancient Near Eastern literature, like, the flood story. I don't know, the legal codes. He talks about Hammurabi at great length. And he does, he's always going to bring that up. And also in this week's Parsha, right? In Parshat Beshalach, he notes that the song doesn't mention any human, right? Not even Moshe, which I think, is an important point. It's one that is frequently noted. And he says that that's in opposition to ancient Near Eastern texts where, you have these songs or poetry which glorifies humans. He also notes, maybe even more explicitly, that so many of the stylistic features of Shirat Hayam retain similarities to Ugaritic poetry, which of course has been noted by others.
Yeah. From what I've seen, Kasuto. What I see that he brings him a lot, and that there's definitely influence from there. I think that also maybe it's interesting to note that it seems, again, we're speaking here from our impression from his book, but it seems that his interest stems from his prism through Kasuto or other commentators. I don't think that was his formal training, meaning I think he's come to it through his exposure to some of those Parshanim.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is, from what I can see about his biography, is that he was trained in Ner Yisrael Rabbinical College and in the Yeshiva Gvoa in Lakewood. That's what it says here in his biography, which I think is extraordinary. Both of these places certainly he wouldn't have, I would imagine, wouldn't have encountered
this training, nor would he be involved in the Syrian community in those places, meaning he had to go where one could learn Torah in those days, obviously, and that's where he could go.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then it says that he received a master's degree in education from the Loyola College of Maryland. So he does have, certain academic training, but not in Bible per se. So from his biography, it seems that he's an autodidact. He is also, I think, and this is very much to my liking, right? He's also very careful to stay, within the bounds of tradition, right? He states very unequivocally that Tanakh is prophetically inspired literature. And even when he talks about the poetic features of Shirat Hayam being similar to Ugaritic poetry, he says, it makes sense from the Pshat perspective that the form of Tanakh should share similarities to what's going on in the culture, but that ultimately it points to a unique idea, and particularly the monotheistic idea, which is so different from the environment. And that, I think, is really, that's very much something that I am looking for. And I think it's pretty remarkable that he's able to acquire all this on his own without any, at least from what I can tell from his biography, without any formal training. He's very, very careful about
his boundaries.
Yeah, but at the same time is really just very broad in his use of sources.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting to note that, so in the last 2 years we have Josh Berman put out the book Ani Mamin for people looking to try and sort of figure out how they can jive all of the knowledge we have from the ancient Near East with traditional views of Judaism. And so you have some readers or things that are sort of able to put things in perspective, let's say. But I would say even with that, but certainly up until 2 years ago before that book came out, if we can call it sort of like a moment in Orthodox awareness, anybody who studies or who goes into the world of academic Bible study, everybody has to come to some sort of personal theology at a certain point. Like, let's just call a spade, right? There's a reason why people were concerned for many years, when young religious people would go into academic Bible study. And so here you have sort of a phenomenal example of somebody who clearly went deep in, was part of an observing community, and came out ultimately with a personal theology, a personal perspective on Tanakh, and how to bring in all of the extra biblical ideas and evidence. And I think that ultimately, even with the greater tools we do have today, or you can go to places that are religious environment, anybody who is genuinely engaging with academic Bible study has to create some sort of personal theology for themselves and their own boundaries. I'm clearly speaking from a very personal space, but I mean, both of us, I assume, right? You jump in the deep end. You have to figure out how to swim, If you want to swim and stay in the pool, you have to figure out what are your boundaries. Yeah. And so here I think is a great example of someone who did that just from a very unexpected direction.
Yeah. No. And I think his readings, and a lot of them really, as you said before, do come from Cassuto. But they
Moshe David Cassuto, the Italian, commentator from the previous century.
Yeah, that you spoke about with Shuli in Parshat Shemot.
In Parshat Shemot, yes.
Yeah, at the end of the podcast of Parshat Shemot. But, he does really, I think, seek to inspire, which is, in my mind, the measure of ultimately a good book, a good essay, a good shir, is that, you're not just doing something which is intellectually satisfying. So, he'll talk about, for example, also in Shirat Hayam, he cites Cassuto saying that Shirat Hayam can be read as a contrast to so much of ancient Near Eastern cosmic mythology, where you have that powerful sea god, right? Remember, that, so much of, our area, our geographical location, right? The ancient Near East, the Levant, is on the coast, and Ugarit as well was on the coast, and they see the sea, and the sea is powerful, and it's monstrous, and it's dangerous. And, what he notes like Cassuto notes, is that in Shirat Hayam, only God rules over the sea. It is God that is above all nature. And that's a chiddush, right? That's an innovative point. So, there's something, and then, he cites also, other psukim that, where we have that image of God, controlling the sea in particular, but all, natural phenomena, psukim from Yeshayahu and Aleph, he cites, but there's others also in Tehillim, in Eov. And what we see, I think, is that there's a sense that the Tanakh is in a certain cultural environment, but it uses that environment to give a very different message. Mm-hmm. One more point about Rabbi Shamah that I think is, it speaks to me very deeply, and partially I think because Chazal do it as well, is that, he reads the Tanakh as one corpus, right? It's not reading each book as a separate and distinct book, but he's very intertextual, right? And, any pasuk or any chapter, any parak that he reads, he immediately sees it within the corpus of all 24 books. And, in my mind, if you don't do it that way, you're going to miss some of the big messages of mm-hmm. Tanakh.
Yeah, where they're all trying to speak to each other and with each other and throughout the generations.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Shirat Hayam, because that's, of course, the centerpiece of Parshat Beshalach, right? We know that from the Haftarah, where Chazal choose Shirat Devorah, or whoever chooses the Haftarah chooses Shirat Devorah in order to emphasize the centerpiece of this parsha, which is a shira. So, what I really loved about the way that he reads the shira is that, he looks at the technique that's used in the shira in order to try to mine it for its ideas, right? And he divides the shira into its different, he calls them strophes, right? Which I guess are really just stanzas. One of the things that he notes that I think is really significant is that each stanza ends with a doubled pasuk, which, Rashi kind of notes that in pasuk gimel, right? Pasuk gimel. Hashem ish melchama, Hashem shmo. And Rashi says, well, there's a doubling here. I think Rashi says it on pasuk gimel, but that's a doubling in the name of Hashem. But then we have it again in pasuk vav, Yemincha Hashem. Ne'edari bakwach, Yemincha Hashem. So the words, your right arm, God, your right, God, is doubled there. And then, of course, we have again in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Mi chamocha be'elim Hashem, Mi chamocha, Mi kamocha ne'edar b'kodesh, who is like you, who is like you. That's our next doubled. And in Pasuk Tet Zayin, we have the words Ad Ya'avor, doubled. And so he first of all, he points it out, which I think is something that, you read Shirat Hayam, we say Shirat Hayam every day in Psukei de Zimra, and we're not necessarily always paying attention to these structural elements.
It's very possible that those also were parts that were sung in a different tune, meaning when you have things that repeat themselves, especially in Tehillim, often the suggestion is, well, there probably was a tune here, and then it's written twice, meaning it's part of the chorus to a certain degree.
Yeah, or maybe even it's
it's reciprocal. Yeah. You have one side saying one, and then they're responding. Exactly.
That's
There's
right.
different theories about how to understand these things. Of course, when we read it just linearly on a piece of paper, we lose some of that element, but there clearly was some sort of liturgical aspect that came along with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one kind of interesting piece of evidence that it was maybe sung in responsa is in Pasuk Kaf Aleph, after Shirat Hayam, when Miriam begins to sing. The word that is used is Vata'an Lahem Miriam, which Vata'an in modern Hebrew means to answer, but in Tanakh
it means to respond.
It means to sing, right? When Yoshua and Moshe have that discussion after Chet HaEgel, he says kol anot b'machana. The sound of singing is in the machaneh, and it achieves at some point a kind of derivative meaning of to answer, because singing was done responsively, right? So here we have this, this kind of description of different paragraphs, which for me really enabled me to see Shirat Hayam as, see the structure of Shirat Hayam. So that's one point that I thought was very important. By the way, the end of the Shirah ends without a doubled pasuk. It ends, again, there's some question as to where it ends, but I'm going to end it in pasuk Yud Chet, Hashem yimloch leolam va'ed, which the fact that it's not doubled makes it so stark. And Rabbi Shamah notes that the word melech with regard to Hashem is used very infrequently in the Torah. And this is, of course, the first place that God is referred to as a king. And he suggests, and I think this is a very astute suggestion, that this is a response to the outsized role of the king in Egypt, the human king in Egypt, so that Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed becomes the kind of final sentence of Am Yisrael's acknowledgement that we've left Egypt. We're no longer in a place where we're celebrating human kingship. Right. Of course, I'll add to that, not something that Rabbi Shamah said, but that the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim opens with a king, right? Vayako melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yadat Yosef, right? A new king arises over Egypt, and it closes with a king. But of course, it's the triumphant kind of conclusion of the divine king. Yeah, I'll say one more thing about the doubled thing, which is that when we read it in Tefillah in the morning, we repeat Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed.
Yeah, nachon, right? It's almost like it's just like an impulse, right? It has to fit with the others.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I only noticed that after I began to notice this doubling in the wake of reading Rabbi Shammah's structural observations here.
So let's talk a little bit about his number symbolism. It almost is like a new age, much more sophisticated sort of gematria. Well, let's see how he really has a whole section at the end of the book, an appendix about number symbolism, and there's an interesting appeal to it. So what did you think about that, Yael?
Yeah. So here's the part where I said I thought it was pretty surprising that I was drawn into it. Rabbi Shamah often talks about symbolism in words, and he counts words. He seems to be a word counter, and he takes this, of course, from Kasuto. You want to?
Kasuto does that also. He focused really on the number 7. It was part of his effort to really try and show the unity of the Torah, and it was part of his effort to really discount the documentary hypothesis by showing that there was a real inherent coherence to the Torah. So he takes it from a whole other level here in this book.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think that I said something not accurate. He claims that he gets it from his Rav, Rabbi Solomon Sassoon. And he says, he quotes him, he cites him a lot.
Yeah, he cites him a lot.
Yeah. And he says that he saw all these number patterns, and now Rabbi Shamah is taking it to the next level. But he also does cite Kasuto. So it's pretty well known that in Parak Aleph, Kasuto finds the number 7 in all sorts of various ways. He says, the first pasuk of the Torah has 7 words, and the second pasuk has 14 words, and the first section of the Torah has 35 Elokims, right? And he does
multiples of 7,
right? And he expands it in his own way. He says, in the prologue of Bereshit Parak Aleph, which he says are the first 2 psukim, there are 21 words, and in the 6 days section there are 413 words, which is 59 times 7, and in the part of Shabbat, which Kasuto observes as well, Parak Bet psukim Aleph through Gimel, there are 35 words, which is also a multiple of 7. Yeah. So, he kind of takes this idea of the symbolism of numbers to another level. He talks a lot about the numbers 8 and 13. Some of it I did not find particularly compelling, but I will tell you what I did find compelling. It's in this week's Parsha. It actually starts in Parshat Va'era, where he talks about patterns of 26. Now, 26, of course, is the gematria of Shem Havaya, of Shem Hashem. And therefore, he is looking for patterns of 26 words. And he shows how at the beginning of Parshat Ve'era, when God introduces Shem Havaya, right? Remember Hashem says, Ani Hashem Va'era El Avraham Yitzchak Ve'Yakov Be'el Shaddai Ushmi Hashem Lo Nodati Lahem, right? I am God. I appear to the Avot with the name El Shaddai, but I never made known the name Havaya. So he says that passage has to be divided into two. And there are 102 words in the passage. And the first 50 words and the second 50 words are the two words in the middle are Ani Hashem, right? So that it ends up that if you include those two words with both halves have 52 words, which is a multiple of 26. So I actually found that really interesting because it's, so Yosefa doesn't like it so much, but what he did in Shirat Hayam, again, he said the first part of Shirat Hayam has 102 words. Is this becoming more compelling for you?
Maybe.
And the 26th word is Hashem Ish B'chama Hashem Shmo. That's the 26th word. So I don't know,
I think that what's interesting about it is that this is the meaningful, magical part for somebody who's so intensely pshat focused, meaning being so pshat focused is, and I am also, okay, in my teaching, but it's spending a lot of time in what we would call in Hebrew the tzura, the form of the text. And so when we spend so much time looking at the tzura, we try and figure out all different ways to mine the tzura for meaning, and so the numbers thing, it pushes my envelope a little bit, you know what I'm saying? But I understand that for someone that's incredibly meaningful. I mean, you read Kasuto about how meaningful he feels the number 7 is, and how for him it is like the pinnacle of the belief of how much the Torah coheres as a whole, and it's very inspiring. Does it do it for me personally? Not so much, but that's okay. It's really fine. But to me, it's deeply connected to the intense pshat focus because I'm not going to go. You and I think both of us find tremendous meaning in wordplay and how Midrash will take a word and it could make me cry in a moment. And for someone else, the number coherence is utterly meaningful for them and great. That's okay.
Yeah, no, I agree with you mostly, which is why I was somewhat pleasantly surprised by the way that this, I thought, worked into the idea of the text. In other words, in both of these passages that I'm citing, and I'm not citing passages where I found it less compelling, but in both of these passages, it intertwined with the introduction of God's name, of Shem Havaya.
Right.
So that when God introduces himself, there's these, kind of plays with the number 26. And when Am Yisrael finally recognizes God's name, and it's so much a part of the Yetziat Mitzrayim story, where Paro's name is erased, right? And instead, God's name is introduced. And so there's this sense of, Leman Saper Shmi B'chol Haaretz. The whole reason that we have this, the plague narrative is to tell God's name. And then when Am Yisrael finally recognizes it, Hashem Ish Melchama, Hashem Shmo, God is his name, there's also this kind of undercurrent of this number pattern. So I liked it because it matched the meaning. I don't think it provides the meaning, but it supports the meaning.
To end the conversation, let's talk a little bit about his approach to Midrash, which, as one can guess from his emphasis on Pshat, he's a little bit more hesitant regarding inculcating Midrashim.
Yeah, well, I mean, he likes Midrashim, and he says that we have to look at Midrashim as moral inspiration, inspirational education. We just have to be very, very hesitant to accept it as Pshat. He actually sees this as a very, very important educational principle because he's afraid that if we take the Midrash too literally, it will lead to mockery, especially
which is what the Rambam. That's directly from the Rambam.
Yeah. So he brings all these examples, and he happens to talk about it in this week's Parsha, in Parshat Beshalach. And here I really, I certainly agree with him that Midrashim have to be read more deeply than just taking them as a literal or historical fact, but actually, I see oftentimes even some of these fantastic Midrashim, even some of these Midrashim which are far from the Pshat, reflect and even provide what I call the deep Pshat pshuto shel mikra, the deeper meanings of the narrative, not just using the narrative as some kind of, takeoff point for educational messages, but really reflecting the deeper meaning. So, I'll give you maybe two examples, and with that we'll conclude. One example is when he talks about the midrash of Yosef's bones being sunk deep into the Nile. So, clearly this is a midrash. We know nothing about this from the text. And yet what I would suggest is that, when you look at Yosef's trajectory, right? He starts out in the land of Canaan. He makes his way to Egypt. He finds his way to the house of Paro. He becomes deeply Egyptian. And the idea that the Midrash, I think, is providing is that, he sunk deep into the Nile, right? He's having a hard time, emerging from Egypt. How beautiful is it that the Midrash says, who's able to pull him out of Egypt? It's Moshe, who makes the opposite trajectory. He starts out Moshe's life as an infant, sunk in the Nile, moves to the king's palace, and then he's the one who moves the people out of Egypt. So he takes with him Yosef's bones.
And you can't forget Serach in those midrashim, right? You have to have the woman there who is going to help them find the keys, is going to help her. Right, you always have to have a woman, even the midrashim, also the nashim tzidkaniot, even in the midrash.
Yeah. So
check out Serach Bat Asher, another one of my favorite topics. Maybe I'll do a different podcast about her.
Yeah, that is true, right? And we saw that also with the women. Her place in the midrash definitely reflects the pshat of the place of the 100%. Women. I'll mention one final example, which again is a midrash that he brought and said, well, it's not pshat, and that is that, when the pasuk tells us in this week's parsha, lo nish'ar bahem ad echad, about the Egyptian army, not even one was left. The midrash says, oh yes, Paro was, right? Some of you may know this from Prince of Egypt. Paro sitting on the rock shouting, Moses.
Mephoresh, Mephoresh in Prince of Egypt.
It's a Mephoresh Spielberg midrash, right? But the midrash says Paro was spared, and Rabbi Shamah says, but this isn't the pshat. But I want to suggest it is the pshat, right? Because it says lo nishar bahem ad echad, and the question is does it mean except for one or not even one? And the answer may emerge from the parallel section that we read as part of the Haftarah, or that we reference as part of the Haftarah, which is the story of Sisra, right? And also in that story, in Perek Daled, we're told that Sisra gets off of his chariot, and Barak, who has chased Sisra's army, kills them all lefi cherev, lo nishar ad echad, right? And we know that Sisra is left.
Exactly. So there means that there is someone left.
Yeah. So, ultimately, I think that in this particular midrash, there's not just an idea, which is pshuto shel mikra, which is the simple meaning of the text, but it even is reflected perhaps in Chazal's attempt to interpret the language.
Right, so you're saying that in this particular note that he has a very particular approach to midrash. For you, it has its limits, that you really want to be careful to still inculcate that and not just relegate it to the world of not pshat.
Yeah, or educational messages, something that is far from the simple meaning. Sometimes it reflects the deeper simple meaning, even if it doesn't reflect history. It's telling you the deeper meaning.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Thank you to the entire Matan team for their input. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website, and write us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.